Okay, so this is Dr. Kraus. I want to give a shout out to Jared for helping me solve a problem that he and some other students were having to do with sign issues when doing subtraction in Arduino, specifically when we're taking an integer minus an unsigned integer and we're storing the result. I think some of my students are storing it as a float, and it seems like float should be the most sophisticated, safest way to do things. But it turns out that if I take a float, set it equal, here, let me just scroll down. If I do this, so e float, e sub fl, is equal to set point minus position. As long as set point is greater than position, this is totally fine. But if position is greater than set point, then this is a negative number, and the floating point number gets something terribly, terribly bad happens to it. So I'm establishing a floating point error, an integer set point, a floating point KP. We're trying to do essentially a block diagram. I think what I'm going to show is generally applicable anytime you're doing subtraction of mixed data types in an Arduino. But in our particular case, it came up in the context of trying to do a line following control based on a line sensor array from Pololu, and we're taking some set point and subtracting from it the position that's actually been measured, and so we're establishing an error. What I'm trying to show is if position is greater than set point, then whether this error, so this error should be negative, and then it matters a lot whether error is an integer or a float, or we need to cast position into an integer before we subtract it from set point, so that when we multiply by our floating point kp, we get a v that makes sense for us. So my set point is 3000, and I'm working through two different values of position, one of 2800 and one of 3200. So in one case, the error should be a positive 200, I'm talking about this error, and in another case it should be a negative 200. So in my loop, I basically just have a for loop that runs twice, once with position 2800, once with position 3200. Sorry, I meant to do that in my Arduino, since you don't want to look at Emacs necessarily. So once with position 200, once with position 3200, and then I do the subtraction as a float and as an int. And then after I have my error, I multiply it by my Kp to get the voltage that in our particular application we would send to a motor as part of our feedback control, both as an int and a float. And so the main thing I want you to see is that when it runs, in the first case, so like I said, set point is 3000, Kp is 0.1, so my position is 2800, making my error a positive 200. Whether it's a float or an int, that works out just fine. And when I take 200 times 0.1, I get a 20 for my V in my block diagram math either way. However, when position is 3200, my error should now be a negative 200. But again, it's kind of a weird perfect storm of variable types. We're taking a float and setting it equal to an int minus an unsigned int, where the unsigned int is larger. And so for the floating point error, it does, I think that's some kind of 2's complement thing that went awry and made a mess. And so even though, and again, we're trying to do feedback control, the difference between a positive voltage and a negative voltage is a big deal. Our robot's turning the wrong way. Instead of getting negative 200 and a voltage of negative 20, we're getting positive 65,336. Again, I'm pretty sure that's a 2's complement thing that didn't go correctly. And so our voltage, instead of being negative 20 that we might have expected in terms of PWM counts or something, now we're getting a positive, so it's the wrong side and it's huge. So two ways to fix this problem. One would be to just make sure that you were very careful to declare your error to be an int and only work in integer errors, and then this, so int equals int minus unsigned int seems to work okay. Maybe a slightly safer thing in both cases. I'm sorry, I can't do this the way I have things set up for me. I'm not allowed to edit, I just view in my Arduino. If I typecast this unsigned int into an int before I do the subtraction, then this is fine. And again, there'd be nothing wrong with doing that in both cases, even though we're only having the problem with the floating point error. So let me kill that. Come back over here. So now I'm getting, I'll see in a second, I'm getting the correct answer no matter what. So case 1, 2800, positive error, positive KP times error giving me V, no problem. 3200, both my errors are negative. In both cases, I've typecast my position from unsigned int to int first and then done the subtraction. And now when I multiply through by KP, I get a negative number as I would expect. So be very, very, very wary. I mean, kind of anytime in C you're working with numbers with mixed data types, things are going to get messy. But apparently subtracting int minus unsigned int and setting the result to a float is not a happy situation. Hopefully this helps.